start the live event. Here we go. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Schools History Project Leeds Trinity event, and thank you very much for coming. My name's Matt Stanford. I'm the director of the Schools History Project. The theme for tonight's discussion is the American West at GCSE, Understanding Conflict on the Plains, or how colonialism obscures student understanding of the Plains conflicts and what we can do about it. This event's come out of a number of recent discussions and debates about how to approach the teaching of the history of the United States in English schools, and has a particular relevance in terms of current debates about decolonising the curriculum. Although options GCSE American West topics have always been popular in the UK, and many pupils continue to learn about 19th century America through the lens of these units, this evening we hope to explore and deepen our understanding about how teachers in the UK can best approach these exam units, with particular reference to the series of conflicts which unfolded during the 1860s and 1870s on the Northern Plains. This session may well raise more questions than answers, but we hope it sparks debate and discussion and inspires all of us to critically examine the way we approach the teaching of this period. I'm now going to hand over to Alex Ford, SHP Fellow and PGCE tutor at Leeds Trinity, who has put together this programme. So I shall hand over to Alex now.
Evening, everybody, and thank you very much for bearing with us. It's great to have so many people here this evening. We've been having a couple of little technical difficulties, so we are delighted to be joined this evening by 4 people, hopefully 4, 3 at the moment, 4 hopefully, with a range of expertise in Plains conflicts, teaching US history, through to wider colonial histories, the way Indigenous histories have been represented in schools, and expertise in school teaching specifically. I'm going to ask our presenters to just introduce themselves briefly. Before I do that, I'm just going to say Catharine Franklin, who's at Texas Tech University, is trying to join us at the moment, and we'll hopefully have her with us shortly, but that is just a little technical difficulty as we go. So I'm going to start, if we can, with Kerry and let her tell us a little bit about her background.
Okay, hi, so I'm Kerry. I'm a secondary school head of history in South London at a school called St Thomas the Apostle College, and I teach both the conflict in the Plains and wider Native American history as part of my A-level specification. And I myself am deeply interested in the story of Native Americans, particularly in the period before the Plains Wars. So when I was at university, I studied the English Atlantic world and was particularly interested in sort of 2 areas, which was sort of the development of the ideas of race and the development of plantocrat society in places like Barbados and Jamaica. But also my big passion and the thing that I found really fascinating was sort of the construction of this idea of the Native American in the English imagination, from sort of first contact with Native American peoples through the colonial wars and how this sort of shifted over time. So I'm very conscious of the ways in which we teach and want to teach Native American history in sort of the best way possible.
Brill, thank you. Have we got Lindsay? Yeah, we've got Lindsay.
Hello, good evening. It's great to be with y'all today. I'm Dr. Lindsay Marshall. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in American Indian Studies at the University of Illinois, which sits on the land of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muskotan, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. I have a PhD from the University of Oklahoma in history, and I came to my particular area of research because I was a high school history teacher in California for 11 years and a department head. And over time, teaching particularly AP US history, I noticed that there were serious narrative problems with how we discuss Native history in US history courses and couldn't figure out how to fix them while I was still teaching. So I made the foolish decision to go to grad school and try to figure it out from there.
Okay, and Paul Edward.
Hi, I'm Paul Edward Montgomery Ramirez. I claim descent from the Monimbuseño Pueblo Indígena of Chorotega people in what is currently the country of Nicaragua. I am a doctor of archaeology and of decolonial heritage. Currently, I am a lecturer at Cleveland State University, which is located on the land of the Ilocos people and the Haudenosaunee, Wyandot, Potawatomi, and at certain times Shawnee and Lenape. So my work is mainly focused on representations and restorying narratives of the past. At Cleveland State, it's one of the only state universities in all of Ohio that features a Native American and Indigenous Studies program. Also, recently I've started a nonprofit, El Hilo Azul, that means the blue thread, which focuses on decolonial approaches to heritage, education, land management, and tourism. I also do tweet at Archeofiend, that's ARCHAEOFIEND.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We are also joined asynchronously by Jimmy Sweet at the Rutgers University, who's Assistant Professor of American Studies there. He wasn't able to be with us this evening, but he did send through some thoughts that in response to some of the questions we're addressing. So I'll be bringing in some of his thoughts as well as we go through. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time before we start just setting some brief context. I know lots of people who are attending this evening are from UK schools, particularly English schools, who are studying GCSE American West units or GCSE US history units. And so I just thought for those people who don't come from that background, it might be helpful just to give a little bit of context there. So for the session itself, we're going to be focusing primarily on those GCSE approaches to history education. Most students who choose to study history GCSE in England obviously choose that at the age of 14 and run through to 16, sometimes earlier. And history is the most popular optional subject you can do, but still only 30 to 35% of our students go on to study history at GCSE. And that raises its own problems. The 19th century America units have been on the course books really since the 1970s as depth studies, American West depth studies, but now they are turned into, in most cases, wider period studies that look at the development of the United States history, particularly in the 19th century, and they remain really popular options. So having looked at the feedback that lots of you have given, I know about 80% of people here this evening are with Edexcel, and the rest are with variously OCR and AQA boards. And I know we've got some exam board representatives with us tonight as well, which is fantastic to have from all the major boards. So the teaching time for those specifications has changed radically, and if you have a look at these, I've just put up the 3 specifications for you to have a look at, and I've highlighted in yellow in those specifications where Indigenous peoples, Native Americans come up in the teaching, and particularly the issues in green to do with Plains conflict specifically. And you can see actually one of the big problems that we have in these specifications is they're very full, they've got a huge amount in them, and they're often told from particular perspectives. And we don't really have time to unpick the specifications this evening, but it's an interesting thing to reflect on in light of some of the things we will discuss tonight. Now, what's really interesting here, I think, is that all of these specifications have quite limited teaching time. The old American West specifications used to be about 35 to 40% of a course. They're now right down to 20 to 25% of a course, which means something like this AQA spec has about 35 hours of teaching time if you're doing a 2-year GCSE. This is the Edexcel version. Again, you can see where the Indigenous histories come up in this, and the interactions between Indigenous peoples and white Americans. And then finally the OCR specification, which takes a very different approach and is much broader, but equally has quite a lot of content. So each of these bullet points, as we look at them here in this OCR one, a single bullet point. So for example, the culture of the Plains Indians, including a case study of the Lakota Sioux, which is how it's phrased in here, is approximately 2 hours of teaching, as it's phrased in here. We'll come on to this, the Indian Wars specifically. And if we go backwards, each of the bullet points in this specification in Edexcel is about 1 hour of teaching, just over an hour of teaching. So there's a huge amount actually to cover in these specifications, all of them. And I think that's one of the interesting things when we talk about some of these issues this evening, is marrying up the pressures of an exam course with how we then do justice to the history that we're trying to teach. And I think that's the big theme that I want to keep going through this all the way through, is how do we do justice to the history that we are trying to teach here. So that's kind of a little bit of context for people. What I would like to do to start with then is just go over to Paul Edward, if we can, and talk a little bit about why we're doing this in the first place, why spend time talking about all of this, and what is it, what makes it matter? Why do we need to revisit and rethink the way we're teaching students in English schools about conflict on the plains, Indigenous peoples in the United States?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, it is a fantastic question. It is incredibly important for us to think about the ways that we do approach these topics. Of course, you know, a lot of people in, you know, the United Kingdom would not necessarily would not necessarily consider this to be a part of their heritage, their inheritance. Necessarily. However, you know, as you know, we'll talk a little bit throughout this, it absolutely is a part of the inheritance of the United Kingdom. We do have everything from Wild West shows that come to the United Kingdom that played into perceptions of people from Indigenous peoples from the plains. But even we've had their paintings in galleries in the United Kingdom of Indigenous peoples from what we call the woodlands area. So that's like the eastern part of the United States, from the Great Lakes region. So there is a very long history of this story. It is very much a part of the story of the UK, even after the American War of Independence. Kind of in a bit of a broader sense of why I would say that this really matters to teach is, so a book recently came out by a photographer named Jimmy Nelson, who is from the United Kingdom. The book came out in 2013. And it's called Before They Pass Away. And what that book was, it was photos of Indigenous people from all over the world in their traditional garb, in images of the way that people expect a native and Indigenous person to look. And the entire book itself was absolutely geared towards a critique of globalism, of cultures essentially vanishing. And that is a massive part of how people think of Native Americans, think of Indigenous people as a vanishing people, of people who sometimes when I'm talking with some people, it's almost as though some folk don't actually think that we actually exist. As if Native people are like akin to like fairy folk or something like that. That we just we happened a long time ago, and now we are all gone, and it was all really, really sad, but there's nothing that we can do. Which, for the fact that there are in the United States, there are, last time we counted, 6.79 million Indigenous people, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, in the United States, which is about 2% of the population. In Canada, the First Nations population is about 1.7 million people, so that's about 5% of the population of Canada. So, we're not small populations, and this conversation around us around Indigenous people. Whether you are a person from the United States, Canada, whether you were a person from the United Kingdom, this narrative of vanishing, this narrative of victimization, we all probably have all watched movies of Native American people being victimized. Be that, Dances with Wolves, be that, whatever movie at the time got you interested or first got Native people on your radar, as it were. And ultimately, yes, if we do want to absolutely talk about the issues that have faced Indigenous people throughout time, up to our own time, which we absolutely need to be mindful of. We have to also remember that it's not just one thing. It's not just a story of victimhood in the past. We have, in Native American studies, we have a term called survivance, which Gerald Visner said, that I'll read this straight from Gerald. It's survivance is an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or a survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. So as we talk about how Native people, and the term settler is a good term for us to use. I think we'll get back to that in the next section, I think. These interactions absolutely do have systemic violence in them, but that's not the entire experience. That's not the entire Native experience. And to make it that way really is not only disingenuous, but it removes the ability for Native people to have anything outside of being seen as victims. Mm-hmm. And kind of the final little point of this is, if we don't, just as a whole, teach these stories, teach these narratives from whatever country you are, then you can't actually know the history of the United States and Canada. You don't know how these countries actually are, what they're made of. For instance, between 1778 and 1871, the United States signed over 500 treaties with Indigenous people. And we often perceive that as, oh, well, that's a Native treaty, that means whatever. But the United States government is very clear in their Constitution. Article 6 says that treaties are the supreme law of the land, in absolutely no short, in no flowery language about that. The United States is its treaties, how the United States acts and is supposed to conduct itself, is entirely based on treaties, of which there are over 500 with Indigenous people that have all gone their own ways, shall we say. But without knowing these contexts, you can't know American history. We can't even talk about, so very recently, the Mashpee Wampanoag people, who, from the American story of identity, they're the people who helped the Pilgrims, who helped these people who first came to the United States in this foundation story of what the United States is. But the Mashpee Wampanoag are currently in a massive legal battle for federal recognition. They had it and got it in 2007. The current administration has tried to repeal that, as well as has seized land that they have taken, they have got back as federally recognized Indigenous people. So this entire narrative of natives being vanished, natives being invisible, you know, we can see it right now. The very people who feature so prominently in this myth of Thanksgiving, this construction of what it means to be an American, they themselves are fighting for the right to exist. So I think that's kind of largely why these are important for everyone to actually think about.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Paul. I think it's really interesting because when Jimmy Sweet sent me his email thoughts on this, he covered his first point was almost exactly the same point you've made there, that we need to do this. The first thing he said is he says the militarized violence of the 19th century needs to be put in context so students understand this isn't a thing of the past. This continues, people continue, and so on. So I think all the time keeping that in the back of our minds is crucial. And putting it at the forefront maybe of our teaching as we go forward and review our curriculum and think about what we're doing. Lindsay, I wanted to come over to you at this point, because I know you've done a lot of work considering how, particularly the Plains Wars, I know we said the bigger picture is important, but we're also talking specifically about Plains conflict this evening. You've done a lot of work considering how Plains conflicts have been presented in the US curriculum. What's your view on the importance of changing the way that we teach white native conflict in the American West?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's a question that, like Paul Edwards said, I didn't really understand the full extent of its implications until I started looking into it, right? And for me, Standing Rock was kind of the, oh, this still matters. And we still see these patterns in modern portrayals of Native people through news media, social media, that sort of thing. So my research specifically examines textbook narratives about these wars. We call them the Plains Wars. They took place more than just on the plains, but everybody focuses on the fight, particularly with members of Chetty-Sakowin Nation, the Lakota particularly. And what I was surprised to find in my research, as I was trying to figure out, everybody agrees that the narratives are terrible, that what appears in US history curriculum is deeply inaccurate. For example, we just celebrated Victory Day on June 25th, which is the day that members of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations defeated the 7th Cavalry under Custer at the Battle of the Greasy Grass, and it's called the Battle of Little Bighorn. And one piece that is missing from that story in curriculum is that Custer was attempting to repeat his massacre at the Washita from 1868. He said in his letters and in dispatches that he pretended to be a newspaper correspondent and sent dispatches to be published in the New York Herald, for instance. And he intentionally stated he wanted to repeat this surprise genocidal attack on encamped peoples, including women and children. But the way we remember the story is this epic clash of military prowess on the plains, and that's very exciting. But it's not a mistake that we remember it that way. As I dug into the origins of these narratives, I was shocked to find how intentionally they were constructed, how consistently they were reinforced. It's fairly famous here in the States that his widow, Libby Custer, spent the rest of her life promoting Custer's valor. Most people didn't really like him at the time anyway, and she kind of turned him into this legend for her own benefit and also just for, kind of whatever the comfort she received from it. And that really caught on in American culture. And there's a reason for that. It's a perfect coalescence of the rise of pop culture, the beginnings of mass media, that sort of thing. But what's really important to note is that that's not a one-off thing. There are organizations of veterans from these wars coordinating newspaper writing campaigns, publishing memoirs, lobbying Congress, and lobbying schools and textbook companies to try to valorize their military efforts in order to gain pensions, because they were left out of the pension rolls, which covered members of the Spanish-American War, the Civil War, and then later World War I. They're still fighting well into the 20s to prove two things. First of all, that the violence on the plains following the Civil War was in some way redemptive, that America had been through this massive conflict, this battle for America's soul, and now we could turn our attention to manifest destiny. And we could take that military prowess and turn that violence against obstacles to American progress, which were always presented in the form of native bodies. The second thing that's really important to remember about how these narratives were constructed is that they were made specifically. Early historians talked to veterans, talked particularly to officers. Textbook companies sought to embed exciting narratives. That became the kind of standard, and textbooks were deeply commercial. So there was a textbook published in the 1920s as a national textbook, and they tried to cut Custer out of it. And after a year of arguing, the editorial board had to conclude that their booksellers in the Northern Plains states simply wouldn't sell the book if Custer wasn't in it. So it's not for lack of trying to eradicate these triumphalist narratives that they continue to exist. And we see those echoes in the historiography as well. Robert Utley, who does amazing work, writes, his biography is called Custer and Me. And he writes about the formative experience of seeing Errol Flynn and They Died with Their Boots On, and reading these early versions of Custer biographies, which textbook authors lifted word for word into their narratives. And the nature of textbook publishing, plagiarism is the norm. And so some of that exact phrasing exists in books in use in classrooms today in the US. So I think it's incredibly important to remember that when we're talking about these conflicts, the narrative is not neutral. The narrative framing is not neutral. Native history is the entire context of US history. It's its chronological context, its geographical context, political, economic, cultural context. And yet our curriculum and the curriculum I'm seeing in these specifications treats it as though it's merely a minor thread, several episodic moments that are important and interesting, but don't comment on the rise of the US state as a whole. And the reverse is true.
Thank you for that. I think it's fascinating. I was going to say possibly how little has changed in terms of textbook publishing. I won't comment on plagiarism as a textbook author, but I probably should. Okay, so one area, I think now we've kind of set up the framing for this and the importance of this. And one big question that came up a lot when I asked people what they were concerned about was the language and the power of the language that we use. So the question, I suppose, is what kinds of terminology should we be using as teachers? What kinds of language should we be using to convey our understanding of what's happening in 19th century US history, and particularly in these interactions? The specifications particularly have very different ways of referring to a whole different range of topics in here. I don't know if you picked them up when we had those on. We have US Americans, we have Indigenous people, we have conflicts, we sometimes have Indian, we sometimes have, I think in one place we talk about the massacre at Wounded Knee, and in another we talk about the Battle of Wounded Knee, and I know people have strong opinions on that particular issue. There's a whole range of issues, and almost every book that I've read on US history at some point has a this is the terminology we're going to use in this book and why. So in an Indigenous People's History by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, she talks about using Indigenous, Indian and Native interchangeably, for example. And talks later about the importance of referring to different Indigenous groups and Indigenous peoples by their preferred tribal names, for example, Diné or Ojibwe or Dakota. So I was just wondering, first of all, if we could get some sense of the kinds of language we might be using. Now, hopefully, and Matt will either confirm or shoot a hole in this now, hopefully we've got Catharine with us on Skype. We're doing some integrated calling here. I'm going to cross my fingers and say hello to Catharine and see if we get something.
Hello, Alex.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you ever so much for joining us. Eventually, we've worked out the bugs of Microsoft software by a roundabout route. So what I'm going to ask is if Catherine, if you wouldn't mind just basically introducing yourself, first of all, would be lovely. And then we'll get into that question. So I'll give you a couple of minutes if you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, because everybody else has had the opportunity so far.
Thank you. Alex, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you. I think there might be a slight delay, but yeah.
Great. What's the specific question you have for me then?
So we're just talking about the kinds of language we might use to talk about the violent events which unfolded on the plains in the 1860s and 70s in particular, which traditionally has been framed as this kind of Indian Wars narrative, which we see in the specifications. We've used conflict on the plains today. Are we using the right terminology there, or are we not using the right terminology? And what should we be saying?
First of all, when it comes to reference and nomenclature referring to Indigenous peoples, we have to remember that we need to approach them and ask them what they wish to be called. The vast majority of my Indigenous friends in the United States prefer to be called Indigenous and Native as a group, Native with a capital N. But more than that, they prefer to be called by the names of their community. So for instance, my Mini Koju friend, he is from the Tetuan people. They're not Lakota. Lakota is the name of their language. It's interesting to note that the Tetuan people have assigned names to their own community based on where the political winds are blowing in the United States. So Lakota is the term that we see arise in the 1970s, 1980s with the advent of the American Indian movement. Russell Means, Dennis Banks, that whole crew. There is now a debate within the Tetuan community of referring to themselves as their own tribal name. And of course, within the Tetuan community are different sub-tribes, so to speak, the Brule, the Hunkpapa, the Minikoju, so on and so forth. So first and foremost, it's important to refer to Indigenous people by the names of their communities and in the languages that they speak. Second, when it comes to conflict on the Great Plains in the 19th century, historians lose sight of a number of things when referring to the Indian Wars. Referring to the Indian Wars, this imposes a structure that distorts our understanding of the past. To speak of the Indian Wars, sense of connection that actually existed. So if we're talking about the United States Army killing of Indigenous people, whether it's the Washita or Wounded Knee, we have to remember that these events are unique. They're different. Those two events occur at a span of more than 20 years. They involve
Sorry, Catherine. I think we're just losing the connection to you slightly there at a key moment.
Cavalry in 1967.
Sorry, Catherine. There's a small network problem. Alex, did you lose Catherine there for a second?
Yeah, I think we just got to the point, Catherine. We were talking about the lumping together of Indian Wars as a whole. And I think it just cut for us just a crucial moment there when you're about to tell us the reason why maybe that's not such a great thing.
I'll proceed from the beginning now. When we talk about the Indian Wars, we are imposing a structure that distorts our understanding of the past. We're embracing a false sense of continuity, and we're reinforcing the mistaken belief that it's a matter of 25 years of uninterrupted armed conflict that is not the case. There was not 25 years of uninterrupted armed conflict in the American West. There were periods of intense violence. There were periods of peace and cross-cultural encounter. If we want to see events such as the Washita and Wounded Knee as part of a continuum, we have to realize that those events occurred at a distance of 25 years, that none of the soldiers present at the Washita were present at the knee. We're talking about people and those play out in different ways. Something that's absolutely critical to remember about using phrases such as the Indian Wars. Second, to use the phrase the Indian Wars robs Indigenous communities of their distinctiveness and power. It gives us the idea that Native peoples, Indigenous peoples can be described as one group, when in fact they themselves had long histories, they had their own motives, their own influences, their own political, social, and economic desires.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, again, apologies that we're having some slight connection issues with this, but I think from that, what we're taking is the importance of not making assumptions, I think is the key message I'm taking here about what terminology we should be using and looking and asking for advice and for guidance. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that and talk about any advice you might offer teachers. I know this is a difficult thing for teachers to grapple with always in limited time and limited space. For even things like we talked about the issue of Wounded Knee massacre. We talked about the issue of we talked about rebellions. We talked about wars when we're talking about individual conflicts. I don't know if anybody would like to come in on that one and just see if we could develop that a little bit further.
Yeah, I could if.
Yep. Thanks, Paul Edwards.
Yeah, not a problem. So yeah, obviously, as an educator, it is reasonably difficult to. Yeah, there are tons of different names and languages that for instance, my people, we go by all sorts of different names, and for by and large legally we are called Chorotega, which isn't a name we gave ourselves, and that's typically something you'll find not just among Indigenous people, but in how people from one language talk about other people, and so there've been a couple questions in the Q&A about the frequency of the use of the word Indian, and ways in which that does get used. I do want to mention that we sometimes do end up using that term because it does have a legal basis, which is very important to recognize. So very often we will end up talking about the phrase Indian country, which is largely a legal designation. However, I don't really know too many Indigenous folk throughout the Americas. I'm from Central America. Who would actually enjoy being called Indian, and so that is absolutely a kind of a starting point, is to recognize that these things mean different things at different times. As was mentioned, there's certain social reasons to use certain language, which can definitely lead to some really good talking points for students of how they talk about themselves and how they talk about other people. How does that change? But we were talking language of continuing with language of violence. Well, these things of rebellions or wars, calling something like a little bit before these conflicts that we're talking about, There is one, it's called very often Pontiac's Rebellion, which happened about a decade and a bit before the War of American Independence. It's very often called a rebellion, but that kind of, what signal does that end up sending to people? Like that, you have to think about what is a rebellion, other than, you know, a subject people who are going against their the authority. You know, that is rebellion. But that terminology shouldn't fit in any of these conflicts at all. What that absolutely does is undermines the sovereignty of Native peoples. And also the language of, you know, battles versus massacres. So in this same conflict, in Pontiac's War, there's a battle that was fought near Niagara Falls in modern-day New York. At the time, in 1763, was called the Devil's Hole Massacre. Basically, it was called that because the British forces were absolutely decimated. They lost so completely in that battle that they were like, oh no, this was so bad, it was a massacre, it was a tragedy, as opposed to two armed forces engaging one another, which is a battle. Meanwhile, in these in a plains conflict setting, we have what is called the Sand Creek Battle of Sand Creek, or the Sand Creek Massacre, which was in 1864. The 3rd Colorado Cavalry, led by John Chivington, they descended on Cheyenne and Arapaho people, and they ended up slaughtering, ended up killing, I'm sorry, I should probably not use the word slaughtering because of its connotations in some senses, but they killed about 500 people, Arapaho and Cheyenne people, and 2/3 of that number were women and children. So using the language of considering that a battle, and then on the other hand, having a actual battle being called a massacre, all that does is it takes control of the narrative, because that leads into the, well, of course, the colonizing force are the good guys in these narratives, so we want to use that language. They, and if we do that in education, all we're doing is continuing that exact same narrative, giving that narrative all the power in the world, instead of saying, well, if something happened to us, you know, to whatever society we belong to, that was similar to Sand Creek, of course, we would consider that genocide. Without a doubt, we would absolutely consider that to be an act of genocide, which is another word that we don't really use.
This brings us on. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there, Paul. This brings us on really nicely, I think, to, well, not nicely, but if you see what I mean, but it brings us on very neatly to where I want to go with this, which is thinking about that framing. And we touched on this right at the beginning, and I think we're starting to touch on it again. It's not just about the choice of language we make, although those are important. It's about how we frame the whole period. It's about how we frame what's happening. So I'm just going to read a little bit from what Jimmy Sweet sent me here. When we talked about framing of the conflicts that occurred in the 19th century, and particularly in the 1860s and 70s, he argued that we need to be really sure that we always frame that through a lens of colonialism. And he argued that colonialism was the condition that laid the groundwork for the conflicts which we're talking about here in the 1860s and 70s. And this is a quote from that email. He says, "No matter who fired the first shot in a particular conflict in the US, in a particular conflict, the US was always the aggressor, always the invader, always the thief of Native American land and resources. And I think there's a lot there that tallies with what you're saying. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who I talked about briefly earlier, goes a step further and talks about genocidal settler colonialism. I know you've just talked about that there, as a driver of conflict and the settlement of occupied lands in America. So can I come over to you, Lindsay, at this point and just say, as somebody who's written, again, specifically about the Plains Wars of the period, how would you argue that we should be framing the period as a whole?
Yeah, that's what I left the classroom to figure out because I realized I couldn't figure it out and teach full time at the same time. What I have ended up concluding is it seems a little bit like a dodge, and I promise it's not. We need to talk to our students about narrative. We focus so much on how do I frame this narrative for my students, forgetting that classrooms are sites of public memory creation, and students are engaged in the creation of their own public memory very actively, hopefully, if our classrooms are doing their job. So what we need to focus on is not so much finding the exact perfect narrative to present to our students in exactly the right language, because looking back over a century and a half of historians wrestling over this particular narrative and educators doing the same, all I can conclude is that we need to approach this with abject humility, and never assume that we totally understand this period of history. There's just so much in between us and what happened. It's very difficult to get our hands around that. So, and that's probably true of any period of history. So what I would do and what I try to do in my classroom now is approach this period by being incredibly transparent with my students about how this narrative was constructed and how this narrative continues to be reinforced, and also highlighting counter narratives that have existed since the beginning. There were Native people writing newspaper articles against the action as it was occurring, but we have this idea that this monolith just appeared and is unassailable. And so I think being open about the construction of narratives, the way narratives exert themselves on our perception of the past, not only does it help us avoid a lot of the dangerous racist pitfalls of teaching periods of history like this, it's also just teaching great historical thinking, and it can apply across so many other topics we want to cover.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you touched there on the counter narratives, and Paul Edward has just reminded me that we haven't really engaged with what we mean by that term, settler colonialism. I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about that for us and just give us a bit of a framing of that.
Right, it's being switched over to me, sorry.
That's my confusion, apologies.
No worries. So what we mean is, so when we talk about the term settler, those are people who are enacting and reaping benefits of this concept called, settler colonization. Which it's very systemic. First, I kind of want to go over like what are the basic points to what settler colonization is. First, that we have to recognize with it is the settler population, they come there to stay. They come there for the permanent occupation of land and to assert their sovereignty over that land. Second is, it's distinct in that it works based on the replacement of indigenous populations with this own settler society. It basically destroys to replace. It's absolutely, it is structural. So we can't really talk about it as just kind of being history, because the structure is ongoing. It doesn't end. So when we are teaching it, we should absolutely, recognize that this is an ongoing force, an ongoing set of systems. It denies people their rights to land, and by making these ideas of vanished people, of no man's land, terra nullius, and in order to kind of go through all of this, go through the logic of replacing people, it means that the colonization, settler colonization, and settlers themselves have to participate. They have to participate in one way or another. You know, it can be the person who is going out and taking land away from people. It can be military officers who are carrying out genocide, who are massacring people. It can be a person from social services who are abducting Indigenous children. It's priests who are converting Indigenous people. And it's also school systems. A person who, once we stop believing that Indigenous people exist, or that they, you know, have rights to what is their land, all of that is it reinforcing the concept of settler colonization.
Mm-hmm. I'm sort of aware, sorry, at this point, just because Kerry, I know your area of expertise has been very much that colonial period, that earlier colonial period. I wonder if we could bring you here at this point and talk about very specifically in the context you teach in, how you deal with that issue of colonialism when you're teaching that to your students, and how you frame that story, and maybe how that might then build into understanding this period.
Yeah, so my area of interest is 17th century colonisation, essentially. And so I think when I approach, so I come onto the Plains conflict at A-level, and I like both taking the story backwards and forwards. So as part of my A-level, which is the civil rights topic, we get to look at that sort of journey from the Plains through the reservation process, assimilation, and then through to like the 1930s, 60s, Red Power. So there's a sense of agency and things coming back. But then I also like to take it back, because I think there's sort of a false sense of periodization when it comes to American history, where we look at things in a very episodic manner. So we have sort of this high watermark of 1776 as like the beginning of America, or we might encounter, for example, the story of the Native Americans in the 1840s with this concept of manifest destiny. And I feel like the term manifest destiny has become like so ubiquitous in sort of American popular culture. I can think about 3 song lyrics that mention it as like this positive concept, that we don't necessarily understand the deep roots of colonization and colonial ideas that come from that. Like manifest destiny doesn't come out of nowhere. So I think it's really interesting to think about the fact that by the 19th century, I'm obsessed with Pocahontas. I love her story and the way it's been constructed and mythologized, and I'm loving the fact that at the moment, even since I went to university, the oral stories of her surviving peoples are starting more and more to be used as sort of sources when looking at her life. But when you look at that sort of period, you already have this concept of the natives as Native Americans or Indigenous people as being a people that need to either be sort of patronized and infantilized and given civilization, you know, More's utopia. We talk about utopian thinking, and that's giving across this idea of imparting civilization on savage peoples. But then we have that movement forward even in the 17th century, where you see these waves of attitudes towards the Native Americans of going from sort of right conversion to then with reality in the face of resistance on the ground in colonial America. This idea already, even sort of in the 2 decades after the English first arrive, of, okay, these are a people that need to be replaced, or these are a people that we need to take the land of. So I'm very conscious of my students not arriving at the Plains conflict without a knowledge of that. So I sort of do I suppose a jack of all trades, master of none scheme of work at the moment, where I look at both the ideas of sort of construction of race across the early modern period in the colonies, but I also look at the story of Native Americans. So we kind of begin with the story of Diego from the Black Tudors book, which I'm sure loads of people have read, as a way of looking into Spanish imperialism and colonization of the New World. And then I sort of almost have like two aspects to it. I think of it kind of as a graph. So I've got the causes of colonization, the reasons why people go to the New World, but then I also go chronologically, because I suppose we've talked about the complexity of the Native American peoples. The English colonists are meeting different peoples at different times and having different experiences in different places. So, you know, in Virginia, you've got the Chickahominy and the Pamunkey as part of the wider Powhatan Confederacy. And then in Massachusetts, you've got the Wampanoag and the Thanksgiving story and all that. So I look into the causes of colonization. So we look at, for example, the idea of greed and wealth. We look at the colonial charters and the fact they talk about like the mission to civilize and take land, for example. And I suppose sort of by the end of my scheme of work that I look at, my students have come to understand that there's this initial mission to convert that's linked to religion and religious ideas, and like the idea of the city upon the hill, which is such a big part of American mythology. But then in the reality of Native American resistance and conflict on the ground, that very quickly shifts and becomes more about trade and power and land ownership. But I'm very aware that even in me teaching that, I'm perhaps not doing the story the best I could. So I'm actually looking at kind of splitting it in two, and on the one hand sort of looking at the construction of race. This is my summer job, and then on the other hand I'm going to look in more detail at just a purely Native American history that looks at the different societies of the people in the 17th century, but then looks at that story through the sources and then how the interpretations of that era have changed over time. Because by the time we get onto the Plains conflict in the 19th century, the popular memory of the 17th century has become weaponized and calcified to a point where it's actually used as a weapon against the native peoples that the colonizers are encountering on the plains. So you have, by that point, the idea of Pocahontas as this southern creation myth, and then on the other hand you have Thanksgiving, which by that point has become quite popular. And there's, you know, thinking about Colston, there's loads of really dodgy 19th century statues that get put up of 17th century colonists who do just awful violence. So my favourite, if you can say favourite one, but one that I can't believe still exists, is Hannah Dustin in Massachusetts, who was a woman who scalped a whole Native American family, and you can still find her statue. I think she's got like 5 or 6 across Massachusetts and Connecticut. So yeah, I try and take the story back, because I think if we just come to the story of the plains, we can kind of fall into condescension or not necessarily understand like what manifest destiny in that idea, where that came from.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm going to see if I can come across to Catherine again here. Matt tells me we might have solved a connection problem. We've touched there, I think, on several things about colonialism, settler colonialism, the inherent violence of that, the development of racial ideas as well in this period. Is there anything else, Catherine, you think people, teachers especially, should have a good grasp on before they start tackling conflict on the plains, particularly that 1860s, 1870s period?
One thing that's paramount to understand is that this is not just a matter of the United States government or an institution within it, the United States Army, attempting to colonize Native peoples. Rabid anti-Indianism, the ruthless, pathological hatred of indigenous peoples, as defined by the Asante scholar Elizabeth Cook Lynn, that is the motive engine behind every single instance of violence against indigenous peoples on the North American continent since the time of the first encounter in the 16th century. Anti-Indianism. And this concept, again, comes from Elizabeth Cook Lynn, an Asante scholar who's now retired, living in Rapid City, South Dakota. Professor Cook Lynn points out that hatred of Native peoples is widespread in the 19th century, and again, it's the motive engine behind so much of the marginalization, the oppression of Native peoples that we see today, from the forced sterilization of indigenous women to the widespread use of Indigenous mascots, to the fact that state troopers from 5 different American states converged on the Standing Rock Reservation and used violence against Indigenous peoples who were trying to defend their homelands. We have to remember that this is not just a matter of state violence or state-sanctioned violence. Millions of individual Americans very much wanted to see Indians wiped off the face of the earth. And although they were not able to make that happen in places outside California for the most part, we have to remember that hatred of Native peoples is widespread throughout this country.
Okay,
it's
thank
not
you.
just a matter of government policy, but it's a matter of individual feeling.
Yeah, I think we will revisit that exact question shortly as well. I think so. This idea, I think, of so the genocidal approach that we've touched on previously. We've touched on a number of things here. One thing we haven't talked about, which several people have mentioned to me when I was preparing for this. I think a lot of teachers watching this will be aware of Manifest Destiny and the idea of Manifest Destiny. I think far fewer will have come across the doctrine of discovery in the context of US America and American expansion in the 19th century. Paul Edwards, could you just tell us really briefly, what is the doctrine of discovery? Why should people know about this?
Thank you for saying briefly. I try to not ramble, but I do that all the time. So what we have to do when we are teaching about colonization of the Americas is we can't just stop at what we were initially talking about of these stories of the Pilgrims and of Virginia colony. We can't just stop at the 1600s. We have to peel this back a lot further, because those actions that led to the narratives that we now keep using are founded in this. So the doctrine of discovery was it's called the Catera it was a papal bull from 1493 that was declared by Pope Alexander the Sixth. That's Rodrigo de Borgia, for any of you who watched the Borgias. And what this basically did is what we now know to be what we now consider Spain, Castilla and Portugal. They're exploring around the world, well, their world, so that is going down into Africa. Effectively, by 1452, we have the Ottoman Empire, who is very much a perceived threat to Christendom. So some papal bulls came out that made it so that way a ruler, in particularly for this 1452 document, that the Kingdom of Portugal was able to conquer and put into perpetual servitude people who were termed to be Saracens or pagans. It was largely seen as a call for another crusade. It didn't exactly manifest that way, but it did help the creation of this system called the encomienda, which was initially utilized by the kingdoms of Aragon, kingdoms of Castile, and Portugal in this period. You probably teach your students the Reconquista, where these Spanish people and these Portuguese people are removing the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. So all of this was tested out in the Iberian Peninsula. So all of that kind of then leads up to this doctrine of discovery, which basically split up the world into who can own it, and effectively that made it so that way we have these treaties where Portugal gets east of X point in the world and Spain gets all the land west of it, which that then translated into other kings and other countries in Europe saying the same thing, that, okay, well, if those two countries, if those two kingdoms can be mandated by God to have this power, this sovereignty over land that they claim, that they find, no big, we can do that too. And so that has been translated over and over and over again to land claims on these discovered lands. Of course, the concept of discovering land that millions of people already live on is utterly ridiculous, but it fed into this narrative of, well, the people who live on this land aren't actually people. There was actually a debate in 1550 in Valladolid, Spain, over the humanity of indigenous people, because there was an issue of good Christian people didn't think that they should be allowed to, that these native people should be allowed to exist. But at the same time, they also needed these people for slave labor. So this discussion over their humanity waged, and basically it fell onto this concept of humanos and anthropos, which one of those is humans, and then, you know, and that is the good Christian European person. And then we have, you know, anthropos, who are things that appear to be human, which is a major distinction, because that then made it so these people that have been encountered aren't people, but they look a lot like people, and maybe in the future, if they come to God and become better, then they might be able to become people. But in the meantime, it's totally fine to make them enslaved, because we have to take care of them.
And I'm right in saying, sorry, Paula, but I'm right in saying here, aren't I, that I horribly oversimplify this now, but the idea of the doctrine of discovery is, you know, based on the things you said there, and we're effectively talking about going somewhere, putting your flag in it, maybe carving your name on something. I read a little bit about burying things just so people could be absolutely sure you'd been there, and that was your claim. And then this builds further on into the 19th century. Actually.
So I can I kind of needed to give that basis on it, but yeah, no, it absolutely is this idea that you can just plant like your little flag, say, and announce to whomever is there. Of course, it's going to be in your language, which these people probably don't understand, and say, you know, this land now belongs to my, you know, my nation, my king, and from that, you know, all of this has led into these systemic issues with race that we see in the modern world. You know, the creation of these classes of people. It's also led to these insane issues of power over land. So manifest destiny, yeah, that is definitely the term that we really know, that most people talk about. So we also have to see that the doctrine of discovery is, I mean, probably not even arguably, it is the strongest piece of legislation that has ever occurred. We see it in the Supreme Court case in 1823. That's Johnson v. McIntosh. Basically used the doctrine of discovery to attach the United States to this entire concept. Thomas Jefferson did it in the 1790s, but this made it an official legal Supreme Court ruling that the indigenous people who have been living on the land for thousands and thousands of years, that they don't have the right to that land because the doctrine of discovery supersedes all of that somehow. So basically, this was used, and we should definitely say that not every European, not every thinker at the time agreed with that. I mean, we have people as far back as the 1520s, Spaniard people from Castile, who are saying, no, this doctrine makes absolutely no sense. So we do have to contextualize it, say not everybody was on board with this, but in the end,
presumably though, for the purposes of when we're talking about people now going out and moving into the West and claiming lands in, say, Colorado or in the Dakotas, they're doing this actually on the basis of the doctrine of discovery, which is reframed through manifest destiny in some way, and it's directly influencing. So again, this for me was a major thing, reading about it and saying, well, actually, I wish I'd been able to contextualize that more. I think this probably brings us on quite nicely, actually, to think about the conflicts, because of course these are precipitated by this doctrine as well.
If I could just very quickly, so what we do also with this, like we also have to very much keep in mind that, this doctrine of discovery just isn't an 1800s thing. One of the in what was it, 1978, Oliphant versus the Suquamish Indian tribe, and Duro versus Riena in 1990 used the doctrine of discovery to completely rule that indigenous people had no capacity, had no criminal jurisdiction over non-native people, which is something that horrifically affects native communities today. If at the end, when we can get to that little bit, which has already been brought up a bit. So this directly has led to violence in modern times against native people, that there's very little legal recourse that can be taken. And it was also used again in 2005. So this is still a vital piece of legislature today.
Sure. Can I come on? And I always want to go deeper into this, because I feel it's one of these things we want to know more and more about, actually. And I hope there'll be some opportunities we might have to give people follow-up reading on this. There is some amazing stuff in some of the reading we'll send out to you after this event. Catharine, can I come to you again briefly at this point? But if we were going to summarise and we were going to say, OK, let's look at the conflicts that happened in the 1860s and the 1870s, particularly on the northern plains, what should all pupils, do you think, go away knowing about those conflicts beyond the things we've touched on already here?
Well, if I understand you correctly, Alex, when it comes to conflict on the northern plains in the 1860s and 1870s?
Yeah. So just thinking about the key things that students, should absolutely know. If they're going to study this for 3-4 hours at GCSE and that's your limited time, what should they definitely leave knowing about those conflicts?
They should know that the Army failed more often on the northern plains than they succeeded. Kirk's disastrous encounter with Tetawan, Cheyenne, Arapaho at Powder River in March 1875. It is is by far not the only occurrence on the plains. The example I always point to is that of the Black Hills. Historians continue to suggest that the Army's defense of the invasion of the Black Hills by white prospectors was half-hearted. That is not the case. In the Black Hills in the 1870s, Army officers and soldiers put a great deal of effort into preventing Anglo-Americans from invading Tijuana land. And in many instances, Army officers actually worked side by side with Tijuana warriors to expel miners from their lands. Major conflicts on the Northern Plains, one that often gets overlooked is the Piggin or Marias Massacre in 1870, which General Sherman and Sheridan Sherman in particular reacted rather strongly to it and recognized that it would wreck the government's ability to deal with Indians for the foreseeable future. So the Marias Massacre in 1870, the Tijuana hold off the Northern Pacific Railroad construction in 1872, 1873, they do that quite well. The Battle of the Little Bighorn is a larger-than-life event, in part because of the people who were involved. But it is certainly only one instance of encounter on the Northern Plains. So there are a great deal of cross-cultural encounters. Army officers talking to Indians. Mini-Koja warrior named Spotted Eagle in 1875 meets with an American Army colonel. And the colonel later reports to his superiors that he was surprised to learn that this Mini-Koja warrior knows all about the building of the railroad and knows all about the plans to build a telegraph line that has yet to be constructed. Tijuana people devoted a lot of energy to ripping up railroads, to killing railroad construction crews, killing surveyors. So when we ignore those kinds of events in favor of large-scale events like the Little Bighorn, we're not exactly giving Indigenous people their due, or their due, rather.
Okay.
It's also important to remember that throughout the plains in the 1860s and 70s, Army officers dispersed millions of dollars worth of rations to Native peoples. Some $1.5 million, if I recall, is the figure. And the Army spends its own money to feed Indians to ensure that Native peoples remain at peace. And that, of course, gets into an argument with the Office of Indian Affairs about reimbursements. But it's important to remember that the Army didn't just fight Indians. It fed them and worked with them. It's also important to remember, as far as Custer goes, that in 1875, at Standing Rock itself, he said, and I quote, "These Indians have just caused a complaint. They are starving. There is no game within miles of their reservation." So even he, who has earned the reputation, not undeservedly, of being an Indian hater, so to speak, even Custer himself recognized and pointed out that Indian affairs were being mismanaged from the get-go by the federal government, by Indian agents, civilian contractors, and so on. Again, the thing to remember here is complexity.
Yeah, so this is really, I was just about to say, it's really interesting. What we're hitting on here is something very complex. I'm going to throw a question over to you, Lindsay, and I'm going to apologise because it's quite a horrible one. Well, it's not a horrible one, but it is a complex one. It's a question of complexity, and it's one that came directly from a teacher. And the teacher in question asked me this: how should we be framing and addressing why questions about conflict on the plains? We follow a specification that we love, but given current discussions, is it appropriate to be considering the role of the Dakota as a factor in explaining conflict? And I think in particular they were referring to the Dakota War, or as it appears in that specification, Little Crow's War. So I'm aware we're running slightly short of time, but can I throw you that question and see what we can do with it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's the question we have to wrestle with about all of these periods of history, and I think it's deeply connected to what we've already been discussing. Paul Edward was talking about the doctrine of discovery, and the fact is that the United States as a legal entity can't exist without the doctrine of discovery, and the existence of the United States here as a legal entity relies on the subversion of Indigenous sovereignty, and it always has. And the Plains Wars are simply an extension of that. So what we don't want to do is run the risk of mythologizing this history in another way to present Indigenous people in an infantilized way, as though they're just kind of minding their own business, being sort of hippies on the plains, and then here comes the evil military. Right? Clearly that's untrue. And if you look deeply into the story of the Dakota War, Dakota people were hugely divided over what their response should be, and this is true in every one of these conflicts. My research has focused more on the Nez Perce War, and that was a huge division in the community, and it's a very human division of people trying to decide what's the right play as these power balances are moving. How do I care for my people? What is the best thing that I can do to make sure that we can survive as a people? So you have to teach it that way, but unfortunately these narratives about Indigenous violence are so powerful. Even just the visuals that appear in textbooks are so powerful and play so deeply into these stereotypes. And like Paul Edward mentioned, we need to remember that these are not long ago images. Right now in the US, the highest statistic for police-related deaths against a group of people are Native men. And that's not a mistake. So we need to be very careful about that. But we also need to present people in their full complexity. And a lot of times when I was a teacher, I would run into in classes asking students toward the end, now you decide who was right. And that's just absolutely the wrong question to ask students to do. What we need to decide is, how do we think well about this? Instead of asking our students to make judgment calls, because even the professionals don't have fully the information that we need necessarily to state definitively what these conflicts were really about. And so that's where I just lean into teaching the complexity of the situation.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really sensible approach. I think it's an approach that tallies well, I think, with lots of work that's been done around teaching similar histories and thinking about the complexity. And I'm aware there are lots of other histories people will have come across that have similar levels of complexity. But maybe, Matt, yeah, sorry.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt. Catherine would just like to add something into that.
Of course, yeah.
It's important to remember, and this goes back to our discussion of nomenclature and terminology, that the incident in 1862 to 1865 is most properly termed the Minnesota War, because it's white Anglo-American civilians in Minnesota who bear the vast majority of the blame for that conflict. To call it Little Crow's War, to call that conflict after Teate Duta himself, his name in Dakota means his red people, Teate Duta, to label that war as his war is unfair to his memory. It is very clear that white Minnesotans engaged in a literal actual conspiracy to take Asante land from the Asante people. And of course, the efforts of Christian missionaries over a period of 20 or 30 years to Christianize them led to internal conflict and then the war itself. But again, if your standards are referring to that conflict as Little Crow's War, I suggest that it be referred to as the Minnesota War instead. Thank you.
I think that's probably an excellent point for people who, especially I've said we've got exam board representatives here. I think that's an excellent point there. I think as somebody who's written, on this subject and has not thought about that before, that I think we all need to take something from that. So I'm really glad you brought that up, actually. Can we go to this final point, really? And it's quite a big question. And it's another one I've been asked, which is, this is a really hard topic to do justice to. Should we be teaching it at all? We've got limited time, we've got limited resources. I've heard people actually make the claim that the the American West type specifications have had their day. They need to just go now. So should we be devoting time to this? Should we be teaching the story, or is it better not to teach it than teach it badly? Lindsay, I saw you put your hand up there, so I'm going to go to you first, then we'll come back to Paul Edward, if that's okay.
I can be very brief. yes, if you want to understand the United States, you can't ignore this time period. It's taught as kind of a tiny capsule of, prime student interest, which you really need when you're coming to the end of term, right? It's exciting. But America remade its identity through these wars. America became, after the Civil War, a frontier culture of manifest destiny, far more than we ever were before them. And you cannot understand American culture and the US state rhetoric without understanding how these narratives function. So I would say yes, and I would say that ignoring it is a form of further erasure of Indigenous history that we just can't afford.
Thank you. Paul Edward.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of continuing on with that is your students, are already going to have so much media about Indigenous people hurled at them throughout their lives, regardless of if you teach it or not to these children who will be adults. They're still going to learn something, and to make it so that way you don't engage with them out of fear. I understand. I completely respect that it is an incredibly difficult and nuanced topic to cover in so little time, but children, they're still going to get images. They're still going to get their ideas of who Indigenous people were and who they are. So what I kind of do want to tie this into is we can't just think of it as a past miss. This is stuff that is still going on. These are issues that are still going on. So from kind of a tourism perspective, each year there are about 2 million foreign visitors that go to reserves, that go to Indian country every year. The United Kingdom is the second largest source of those foreign visitors, which, it makes up an insane amount of money to these reserves, about $9 billion a year, which that's an incredible amount of money if we're talking about a group of people that the Selig Center for Economic Growth out of the University of Georgia, they divided up the daily average buying power that somebody has based on their racial identity. Your average white person in the United States has a daily buying power of about $178. A black person has about $86. Latino has about $73 per day, and your typical, your average Native American person has an average daily buying power of 78 cents a day. So that's an insane disparity. That's an incredible and impossibly difficult disparity. So absolutely, these nations want to have economies come to their lands. But if you have this many foreign tourists who don't engage or don't have something a mindful understanding of the people they're visiting, then they can help to recreate all of the damages that keep getting done to Indigenous people. They can lead into stereotypes, which we know in Canada. First Nations people have and this is going to get heavy, so apologies in advance. First Nations people have 24.3 suicide deaths per 100,000 people per year. Inuit people have about 72.3 suicide deaths per 100,000 people. In comparison, settler populations, they have suicide rates of 8 deaths per 100,000 people. And psychologically, we know that this is very much connected with a lot of issues that Indigenous people face, racism, with mascots absolutely dehumanize people, dehumanize. So do a lot of the images that Native people end up seeing. Absolutely dehumanize, demoralize them. And so that can lead to a lot of mental health issues. In addition, and kind of the last little bit of this is, I talked about how Native people in the United States don't really have the ability to, don't have criminal jurisdiction against non-Native people, as per the doctrine of discovery. So what we have found out is, not only are Indigenous people, Indigenous bodies criminalized the most in the United States and in Canada as well, but they're also murdered the most. So there is the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There, it can extend out as well to different gender identities too. But there is, this is again a stat from Canada, but it's largely the same in the United States. So there, from 2001 to 2015, this study was conducted that showed that Indigenous women were murdered at a rate of 4.82 per 100,000 of the population. Meanwhile, at large, Canadians were murdered at 0.82 per 100,000 members of the population. It's a horrific disparity. And the fact is that most of the people who are, so in the United States, about 84% of Indigenous women have reported experiencing physical violence in their lifetimes. And over half of Indigenous women in the United States reported being sexually assaulted. And a massive sum of these numbers of the people who are carrying out these assaults are non-natives. So
I think to me, what we're establishing here is that beyond anything else, if we talk about the historical reasons for studying something, there are huge moral reasons that we need to be doing something like this. I'm aware, people, that we're running slightly over time here, so I want to just come very briefly to Kerry, because I know you've got a couple of things you wanted to just add in at the end here, and then I will point people towards what happens afterwards and some reading and some other things you can go away and get involved with. Oh, I think you're on mute, Kerry.
I'm always very conscious of my cat, so I've just muted myself. Yeah, I suppose what I would say was that I do think that this is a really important area of history to understand. I would say that myself as a history teacher, actually, having studied early America, when I came into my teaching career, I felt very uncomfortable with the idea of teaching the American West, purely because I was concerned, sort of, coming from an interest in Irish history as well, and like the potato famine and the emotions there and the stereotypes that you get through that particular history, that I was really worried that teaching the American West could all be about engagement. And I had these visions of like cowboy and Indian films from the 1950s. But I think it's sort of our moral mission as teachers to think about the ways that we can teach these histories in the best way possible, because this is still a living, breathing history. And even when you go back to the area that I'm interested in, the 17th century, those peoples are still fighting for their rights and to be recognised by the American government today. I think what it does, and I completely understand, the ideas of being concerned about curriculum time and all that sort of stuff. I teach at a school that's very, very pressured in terms of me getting results. But I think there are ways in which you can weave in these complexities and these ideas without necessarily losing that curriculum time. So just even a conversation about why, the idea of why the labelling of wounds changed over aside very quickly in a lesson, or thinking actually about your key stage 3 as well. No.
Oh, I think we might have lost Kerry there.
I don't know if I've even come back in.
Oh, you're back in. You're back in.
Sorry, I'm Virgin Media. It's so rubbish. I shouldn't say that. But the last thing that I was going to say is we can, if we're lucky enough. I mean, I only have a 2-year Key Stage 3. I've only had a 2-year Key Stage 3. This year is the first year that I've had a 3-year one. But I think we need to think about the ways in which we get American history into our Key Stage 3 curriculums. And I won't take up any more time, but if you blog, I'm very on sort of moaning about the fact that we need to get more American history in our Key Stage 3. So you can read my one about why I think we need to teach colonial America before we sort of hit the plains, which I wrote quite recently. It might be helpful. But I suppose that's my sort of last thing, is I think we need to be aware of the complexities, but also as history teachers, we need to be accepting of that, because it's a really powerful tool of actually helping us help our students to understand that history is a constructed and changing thing over time anyway. And who knows, you know, if you show the complexity, you might actually get a couple of kids think, oh, actually, I quite like the sound of history, taking it up to A-level and university, when you get to have these arguments and debates and it shifts so much. So yeah, I suppose that's kind of the last thing I would say before I start waffling on about Pocahontas or something.
Brilliant, thank you. And actually, I think we missed it in a slight bit of interference there, but the blog is kerryapps.com. And there'll be a link out. We'll put links out to all these things afterwards as well. I just wanted to finish here very briefly just by sharing some recommended reading. We'll send out a reading list as well. We've tried very hard when we've done this to think about things that you can access as teachers in a quite straightforward way, and that will hopefully give you some overview quite quickly. If you read one thing though, this collection of essays, really collection of chapters, Why You Can't Teach United States History Without the American Indians, is a really lovely starting point, because it's specifically written for teachers. And it does cover in chapters 5 through 10 the whole range of issues you're going to have to cover in this course, and it has an entire chapter on dealing with settler colonialism as your core narrative of American history. So I think that would be a really great starting point. I hope everybody has enjoyed this evening, and thank you for bearing with us with any of the technical difficulties we've had. If you have enjoyed it, please do tweet out about it. We've got SHP Understanding is the hashtag if you want to talk about it. We will hopefully, if you're interested, do some more events around similar themes, maybe with more focused themes on planning for teachers, or maybe bigger themes if you're interested about other aspects of American history, and whoever I can press gang into that. But for the moment, can I thank very much Kerry and Catherine and Paul Edward and Lindsay for your time this evening and for your expertise. And I hope it just gives us some starting points to have these really important discussions, so that we can go into teaching American history, US history specifically, with a better, more rounded understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, and our moral purposes as teachers in doing that as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much to everybody. Thank you very much to Alex for organising that. It's absolutely brilliant. Just before we wrap up, finally, just want to say there's still time to get your tickets to the SHP Summer Conference, which is on the 10th to the 12th of July, and it has a fantastic lineup. So thank you for attending. I hope it was useful and interesting, and I will say good night. Thank you very much.